What if the Philippines had become America's largest state, right in the middle of World War II? Overnight, that would mean adding roughly 17 million people, about an 11% bump to the US population, along with American bases sitting just a few hundred miles from Japan. Think of it like planting a second mainland across the ocean. That scale raises big questions. How would Washington's strategy shift with an Asian state on the books? Could the Cold War have played out without the same bloody interventions? Like and subscribe if you enjoy exploring alternate history scenarios. Because before we can answer any of that, we have to ask the hardest question first. What happens to America's identity when its borders suddenly stretch across the Pacific? In this alternate timeline, America wouldn't just grow in size. It would redefine what being American actually meant. A Philippines brought in as a state wasn't a simple territorial adjustment. It would shift the country's very core, forcing the United States to reconcile a continental self-image with a full-fledged identity planted deep in Asia. The question then becomes, how does a nation built on one set of assumptions absorb millions of people with different histories, languages, and traditions without fracturing? In this alternate timeline, America wouldn't just grow in size. It would redefine what being American actually meant. A Philippines brought in as a state wasn't a simple territorial adjustment. It would shift the country's very core, forcing the United States to reconcile a continental self-image with a full-fledged identity planted deep in Asia. The question then becomes, how does a nation built on one set of assumptions absorb millions of people with different histories, languages, and traditions without fracturing? Start with the numbers. In the 1940s, the Philippines had over 17 million people, about an 11 to 12% bump on top of the US population at the time. That's not a footnote. That's nearly doubling the size of America's immigrant story in a single move. And unlike past migrations, this new population wasn't coming by ship or passing through Ellis Island. They'd enter as citizens outright, voting, sending representatives to Congress, and demanding recognition. Statehood wouldn't just reshape maps, it would reshape ballots. And in Washington, that kind of voting weight comes with power. Think more seats in the House, 2 senators guaranteed, and the political calculus of the 20th century knocked off balance. But representation is only half the story. On the cultural side, the Philippines was already complicated long before the US came in. More than 135 native languages, dozens of ethno-linguistic groups, layers of Spanish Catholic tradition, and a long colonial past mixed with indigenous roots. Yes, there were strands of American influence, public schools teaching in English, democratic structures modeled after Washington, but that didn't erase the centuries of identity already baked in. So yes, assimilation might technically have been possible, but only through the same blunt campaigns the US had already tried elsewhere, renaming streets, expanding English-only schooling, and encouraging cultural Americanization. The difference here, you weren't dealing with a tiny minority. You were talking about an entire island nation with millions ready to resist if pushed too hard. So the outcome? Likely tension. Maybe strikes over representation. Maybe cultural movements asserting Filipino traditions as American traditions. You could call it an identity clash, but really, it's deeper a tug of war over who gets to define normal in this larger America. Now picture the debate in Congress. A state of this size would send a hefty delegation across the Pacific. Overnight, senators and representatives from Manila and Cebu would weigh in on civil rights disputes, military budgets, or how federal money gets split. That's not a hypothetical ripple. That's bargaining power. And in the mid-20th century, when lawmakers already bristled at shifts caused by smaller states, this would have been explosive. Some would see it as a triumph of democracy. Others would dismiss these new voices as outsiders. The battle lines wouldn't be only party versus party. They'd be geographic, cultural, and racial. Meanwhile, federal funding would become the next flashpoint. America, in this alternate timeline, would be on the hook for a state that sat in the middle of typhoon paths and earthquake zones. Each storm season, federal relief and reconstruction efforts would be stretched just to keep infrastructure standing. Think roads, hospitals, airfields, communications, across thousands of islands. Even in peacetime, that's expensive. Layer in wartime costs, and suddenly taxpayers in Kansas or Ohio might be asking, why is so much of our money being sent halfway across the ocean? Whether that criticism is fair or not wouldn't matter. Perception alone could fuel resentment. And yet the identity shift wasn't just about challenges. If Filipinos entered the American project fully as citizens, so would their cultural strengths. Catholic celebrations, indigenous practices, communal approaches to social life. All of this would have seeped into what Americans thought of as their shared heritage. Put bluntly, the melting pot metaphor might have collapsed under the weight of so much variety. Instead of melting, you'd get layering. America would have been forced to become a federation of many cultures, maybe decades ahead of where it actually landed on multiracial politics. Look at international optics, too. With a Filipino state inside its ranks, America might have looked less like a purely Western empire and more like a multi-continental democracy. That in turn would ripple out to how allies and rivals alike interpreted Washington's motives. Was the US still just another colonial power with flags planted far from home? Or had it really turned into a pluralist state? Messy, large, but undeniably global? Of course, these shifts wouldn't have been clean. Racism was entrenched in American life at the time, and the sudden elevation of millions of brown, Catholic, multilingual citizens would almost certainly have met with pushback. Maybe it would have been subtler than outright exclusion, maybe not. But it would have challenged the United States to live up to its own talk about being the world's beacon of democracy. And that test would have arrived well before the civil rights movement ever gained traction. So, what does all of this mean? A Philippines as a state wouldn't simply make America bigger. It would make America different, louder, more complex, and less able to cling to a single, narrow identity. The contradictions at the heart of the Republic, freedom versus exclusion, openness versus fear, would show up sooner, in sharper relief. And then comes the strategic question: if America had absorbed these islands along with their people, what would it have done with their location? Because the Philippines wasn't just culture or population, it was geography. And in the middle of the 20th century, geography in the Pacific meant power. If America had taken the Philippines in as a state, it wouldn't just mean new citizens. It would mean stepping into the role of an early Pacific superpower. Instead of a far-flung territory loosely managed from Washington, the islands would have been a core part of the Union, giving the United States both a reason and a mandate to plant serious power in Asia. Think about the 1940s. World War II is heating up, Japan is on the move, and suddenly the US doesn't just have a presence across the ocean. It has a state only a few hundred miles from Japan and China. That kind of proximity changes the map. The Philippines wouldn't be an afterthought. It would be a frontline base. And with statehood, the US could have justified far more pre-war militarization there. An advantage that might have reshaped the early Pacific campaign, even if it risked provoking Japan to strike earlier. This wasn't just speculation. General Douglas MacArthur, who had once served as Governor General in Manila, openly warned about Japanese aggression. He knew the terrain, he knew the vulnerabilities, and in this alternate timeline, his calls for extensive fortification would have carried more political weight. If Washington had listened sooner, you might see airfields, radar stations, and naval facilities built up before 1941. That's not a guarantee of safety, but it would have given the US more options once fighting began. And Pearl Harbor? The attack could still have been devastating. But with part of America's Pacific assets distributed between Hawaii, Guam, and a fortified Philippines, the blow may not have been quite as crippling. More operational airstrips and dispersed bases might have kept the US better positioned to push back quickly. Again, no certainty, just a strong possibility that the Pacific front starts a little less lopsided. From there, the operational consequences multiplied. Geography meant the US could contest supply lines that kept Japan fed with oil and raw materials. Bases in Manila or Clark Field would put American fleets and bombers right in striking distance of the arteries that ran from Southeast Asia to Tokyo. Shorter supply routes for the US, longer and riskier ones for Japan. That alone could have shifted the pace of the Pacific War, forcing Japan to make tougher choices earlier. But geography cuts both ways. An entrenched state brimming with US bases might have looked like a bullseye to Japanese planners. It raises the risk of early attacks on airfields, ports, even cities. In that sense, statehood could have turned the islands into a magnet for destruction before American defenses were ready. Geography as an edge, but also as bait. Beyond the battlefield, there's economics. A state in the Philippines plants America directly on the shipping arteries of Asia. That means early access to markets in China, to resources in Indonesia, and to the trade networks of Southeast Asia. You're not looking at a side business. You're looking at the US building economic dependencies decades before its real-world trade boom with Asia. The Philippines becomes the hub. Trade agreements flow, influence grows, and economic leverage translates into political sway. Now add in the colonial picture. Britain controlled Malaya, France had Indochina, the Dutch ruled Indonesia. In our timeline, America didn't really confront those colonial networks until after the war. But with a full state sitting in the middle of Asia, that standoff shifts forward. The US would essentially announce itself as a permanent Pacific player, promoting its state as a democratic model against Europe's colonies. Would London and Paris see that as friendly partnership or encroachment? The seeds of decolonization might have been planted much earlier. with Washington playing a far larger role in the script. Logistically, the advantages stack up. Aircraft carriers cruising at shorter ranges, bombers able to strike further inland, supply chains anchored on stable American soil. All of that lowers costs, shortens timelines, and makes it easier to sustain a war effort thousands of miles from the western seaboard. In an alternate timeline, the Pacific Campaign doesn't just happen faster, it also cements America as the indispensable power in Asia, well before the Cold War. And the perception? That's tricky. To some in Asia, the US could have looked like a welcome counterweight to European colonialism. To others, a giant planting its flag half a world away looks less like liberation and more like empire dressed in red, white, and blue. Statehood for the Philippines blurs that line even further, because unlike a colony, a state is permanent. That permanence makes debates over America's role in Asia unavoidable. Protector, partner, or imperialist? The answer depends on who's looking. For Washington, though, the calculation tilts toward power. On paper, the benefits outweigh the risks. Control of vital trade lanes, a permanent base of operations, and a stronger hand in shaping the post-war order. The stage is set for America to walk into the second half of the 20th century, not just as a Western power, but as an early Pacific superpower. But having that foothold raises the next question, less about how to fight wars, and more about how to fight ideas. If the Philippines had joined as a US state in the 1940s, what would that have meant for the rise of communism across Asia? And would American democracy have looked more convincing planted in Southeast Asia itself? Could statehood for the Philippines have changed the trajectory of communism in Asia? Put bluntly, it might have. A US state planted in Southeast Asia could have offered a democratic counterweight and chipped away at communist appeal, but it also would have painted a target on Manila's back, turning the Philippines into both a symbol of US reach and a likely rallying point for insurgencies. That dual dynamic is the core tension of this what if. After World War II, communism expanded with dizzying speed. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with Mao Zedong's victory, giving Asia a communist giant virtually overnight. Then came movements in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, even insurgencies bubbling in Malaya and Indonesia. For Washington, that was the moment when containment turned from theory into decades of real wars. And you have to ask, would having a state embedded in that region have reshaped the opening act of the Cold War? Symbolic weight matters. The Philippines as a state wouldn't just look like a treaty partner or willing ally, it would literally be America woven into the fabric of Asia. That carries a stronger message than bases on borrowed soil. It tells wavering nations, you don't need communism to modernize after colonialism ends. Democracy, tied to US institutions, wages, and infrastructure, could be shown in action, not just sold as rhetoric. Schools, industries, and federal programs could stand right next to rural communities struggling with inequality. That demonstration might not have stopped communism cold, but it could have made the ideological choice less clear-cut for Asia's new leaders. Policy influence is the second stake. Statehood means representation, and Filipino lawmakers would have sat in Washington with committees, votes, and influence. They wouldn't just lobby quietly from the outside, they'd have first-hand knowledge of Asia's politics, insurgencies, and economic traps. In theory, that could tilt American diplomacy. Earlier warnings about Vietnam, sharper debates about Korea, stronger arguments for investing in Southeast Asia, rather than only in Europe. It doesn't guarantee different outcomes, but it does open an alternate path where US Cold War strategies sound less like guesswork from afar and more like policy drafted with regional expertise baked in. Economics isn't small here either. Communism found traction not simply because of ideology, but because it promised something new to populations that felt abandoned and unequal. In an alternate timeline with the Philippines prospering under statehood, the economic counter-narrative gets louder. A booming Manila tied to American federal dollars, ports filled with trade, rural electrification programs carried out with Washington's support. This is a different kind of argument, one rooted in delivering visible results instead of lofty promises. That contrast could have blunted communism's appeal in neighboring countries, if only by showing that aligning with the US meant material gains rather than more tutelage under colonial hands. But here's the trade-off. Presence invites pushback. Inequalities in the countryside wouldn't vanish just because Congress stamped statehood on the Philippines. Land reform, poverty, and ethnic divides would still fester. In that environment, communist groups likely would not disappear. They might even grow stronger by casting themselves as nationalist defenders against American occupation dressed in democratic clothing. Insurgencies could be more intense precisely because the Philippines was no longer a semi-detached colony, but an actual US state. That gives rebels propaganda ammunition. Fight the empire in our backyard. And resource strain is real. Maintaining a far-off state in an unstable region would demand constant resources, just when Washington was already pouring money into rebuilding Europe. Balancing NATO commitments with a Southeast Asian state could leave US budgets stretched thinner and American forces pulled in conflicting directions. Statehood wouldn't erase proxy wars. It might require even more interventions to put down uprisings at home while still countering communism abroad. So you get two competing realities. On one hand, a democratic foothold that undermines communist messaging and showcases an alternative pathway. On the other, a battlefield in waiting that turns Filipino soil into the opening front of the Cold War. Neither is neat, and that's why the question can't be answered with a simple yes or no. Maybe fewer wars erupt if Asia sees a viable democratic model early on. Or maybe Washington finds itself fighting insurgents inside its newest state while still sending troops to Vietnam. In this alternate timeline, both versions are plausible. Statehood could have saved lives, but it also could have multiplied the fronts where lives were lost. The Philippines, as a US state, would not have been a silent player in the Cold War. It would have been center stage, sometimes as proof of democracy, sometimes as proof of empire. And that's the broader pattern, a single decision changing not just strategy, but perception. And perception matters, because how colonized nations viewed America's role in Asia didn't just shape the Cold War, it shaped what came after. If the Philippines had joined the Union in the 1940s, the ripple effect wouldn't stop at communism. It would bleed straight into how decolonization unfolded across the rest of Asia. In the late 1940s, the global story shifted from empires to independence. British, French, and Dutch colonies that had seemed permanent suddenly began splintering off into new nations. But imagine if, right in the middle of that cascade, the Philippines wasn't standing on its own, but had already been absorbed as America's 49th state. That changes the script entirely, because the Philippines would no longer serve as proof of a successful independence movement. It would serve as an American experiment in expansion at the exact moment much of Asia was trying to break free. At first glance, statehood could have looked like a radical alternative to European colonialism. Washington would not be propping up a puppet government, but instead claiming, at least symbolically, that Filipinos were equals inside the American system. That would have stood in stark contrast to Britain trying to keep Malaya, France clinging to Indochina, or the Dutch desperate to hang on to Indonesia. To some eyes, this could have seemed like a model of progress, proof that a former colony could evolve peacefully into something bigger. Leaders like Indonesia's Sukarno might have pointed to it as an example worth studying. Nehru in India, always alert to the contradictions of Western power, might have seen hints of a future where colonial subjects were treated as political partners rather than wards. But spin the angle slightly, and the picture tilts toward hypocrisy. For nationalist leaders who believed independence meant true self-determination, American statehood for the Philippines would look less like liberation and more like annexation. Were Filipinos really equal in a Congress where they'd be drastically outnumbered? Or would they remain a small bloc in a country that always called the shots? Many in Asia already doubted American claims about standing for freedom. Seeing the stars and stripes planted permanently in Manila might confirm their suspicions. Where one leader might see peaceful integration, another might see the face of a new empire draped in democratic language. Symbolism is what makes this scenario so tangled. From a distance, the Philippines could appear as a beacon for post-colonial nations, a place where modernization, American money, and democracy were fused without the bloodshed of revolution. Yet the closer you got, the more it risked looking like another Western overlord dressed up as partnership. If US bases crowded the islands, if Washington dragged its feet on land reform or economic equity, then statehood would become a tool for insurgents who already argued that democracy was just another word for Western domination. For European capitals, statehood would hit differently. To London, Paris, and The Hague, struggling to convince the world their empire still had legitimacy. America's decision to absorb a colony outright could look like a political betrayal. Was Washington trying to undercut them with a flashy experiment? Or worse, setting a precedent that made the colonies they depended on harder to defend? It's not hard to picture quiet fury in European foreign ministries. Would they accuse the US of tearing up an unspoken understanding that great powers didn't interfere with one another's possessions? Would they push back by shutting America out of influence elsewhere, even in Europe itself, to balance the score? Here's where the domino effect becomes murky. For some movements, a Filipino state under US protection might have been encouraging evidence that an alternative path existed between old empire and total revolution. For others, it might have made the threshold of independence even higher, suggesting that full sovereignty only came through alignment with a superpower, not by standing alone. That tension could cut both ways. Gandhi's India may have drawn lessons about peaceful transition, while hardline nationalists in Burma or Vietnam could just as easily have used the Philippines as proof that what looked like progress was really just another cage. And that uncertainty is the deeper point. The Philippines as a US state wouldn't have simplified decolonization. It would have complicated it. Some nationalist leaders would borrow its symbolism, others would spit it back as a cautionary tale. Some colonial rulers might feel pressured to let go earlier, others might grip tighter, fearful that US expansion was an omen of things to come. In this alternate timeline, decolonization might still sweep Asia, but its rhetoric, its strategies, and its legitimacy would all play out against a backdrop where one of the region's largest nations had been taken permanently off the independence board. And with that comes the hardest question of all: what does it actually cost to hold and maintain such a state? Because behind the symbolism and the speeches lay a brute reality. Turning the Philippines into part of America wasn't just a political experiment. It carried a huge price tag. So, when you look beyond the symbolism, the real question becomes, what would it have actually cost to keep the Philippines inside the United States? Statehood wasn't just about waving flags or passing resolutions. It meant absorbing the expenses of a vast, disaster-prone archipelago at a time when America was already straining to fund wars, recovery, and a Cold War abroad. The geography alone stacked the odds. The Philippines sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where volcanic eruptions and earthquakes are routine, and it's hammered by some of the most destructive typhoons on Earth. In a statehood scenario, each catastrophe would trigger the national emergency response, on par with hurricanes in the Gulf or quakes in California. Except this was half a world away. Federal dollars and supplies would need to cross thousands of miles to rebuild roads, ports, homes, and hospitals. And this wasn't a one-time bill. Storm after storm could wipe out entire districts, forcing Washington to spend again and again just to keep the state functional. Disasters weren't an occasional crisis here. They were part of the climate. Disasters were only the beginning. Infrastructure was another yawning gap. In 1940, Manila had urban development and some modern systems. But outside a few cities, much of the Philippines had poor roads, limited bridges, and unreliable communications. As a state, federal pressure would mount to extend modern infrastructure across thousands of islands. Highways, ferries, and airfields would need to be built practically from scratch in wide swaths of the country. Think of it like trying to knit together a state stretched over the Pacific itself. Building the interstate system in the continental US was already a decades-long budget-heavy feat. Replicating that, fragmented across an archipelago, would have multiplied costs and tested Washington's capacity. And then there's public opinion back home. Voters in Michigan or Iowa might admire the idea of democracy expanding, but when they saw repeated relief packages leave their paychecks to fund typhoon-struck provinces or rural electrification half a world away, patience would wear thin. Even in our timeline, Americans often resisted federal investments they thought favored someone else. A distant, storm-battered island chain as a state could easily have looked like a bottomless pit of spending. Would taxpayers have understood the strategic value? Or would resentment harden? Especially if mainland infrastructure projects were delayed while funds went to the Pacific. That divide could have made the Philippines an easy political scapegoat in tight elections. Now add the military burden. Strategically, the Philippines would have been a jewel, a base within striking distance of Japan, China, and vital trade routes. But assets of that caliber require constant protection. Bases, airfields, naval yards. None come cheaply. Defending a state so exposed would lock America into high military spending, not only in wartime, but permanently. Cold War tensions would guarantee expanded garrisons and endless upgrades. And if insurgencies targeted the state as America's most visible foothold in Asia, then troops, material, and money would pour in to keep sovereignty secure. That leads to the core trade-off. Would the defense benefits actually outweigh the massive civilian reconstruction and disaster relief obligations? Every dollar fortified Manila Bay might be a dollar not spent rebuilding homes destroyed by a storm. The one factor working in America's favor would be manpower and resources. Statehood would bring millions of new citizens into the fold, many of whom could serve in the armed forces, power industries, and reinforced labor forces at home and abroad. The Philippines also had valuable raw materials, timber, minerals, agricultural products that could feed into American supply chains. There would absolutely be economic upside and access to labor, resources, and Asian markets. But those gains wouldn't arrive free. They would have competed with, and often been overshadowed by, the immediate drain of reconstruction demands and military defense budgets. For Filipinos, the balance might have felt even sharper. If federal aid was channeled more toward military infrastructure than civilian improvement, resentment could build. A rebuilt airfield doesn't house families after a typhoon. A naval base doesn't replace farmland lost to flooding. Even as citizens, many would likely feel that their priorities lagged behind America's broader strategy. That tension between being protected and being neglected could echo for decades. And for Americans at large, the Philippines as a state would be a dividing line. Some would view it as proof of US global leadership, a tangible commitment to democracy abroad. Others would see a money sink, an endless expense ledger written in floods, earthquakes, and security crises. The very idea of expansion would have been polarizing in a country already arguing over taxes, civil rights, and foreign interventions. So where does all of this land? Statehood for the Philippines would have been a strategic boon and a clear extension of US presence in Asia. But the bill for keeping it functional, defense, reconstruction, modernization, wouldn't stop arriving. A strategic win, yes. But one with a heavy recurring price tag. And those costs wouldn't just shape mid-century debates. Over time, they'd ripple into how America itself grew, how its culture shifted, and how it measured its identity. Which raises the next question: if the Philippines had been in the Union since the 1940s, what kind of United States would you recognize today? Fast forward to the present, and the United States with the Philippines as a state wouldn't quite resemble the country you recognize now. Demographically, politically, and culturally, it would feel less like a continental nation with overseas ties, and more like a federation that stretched across the Pacific. If Filipinos had entered the Union in the 1940s as full citizens, their influence wouldn't linger at the edges of American life. It would sit at the center, woven into how the country defines itself. Over the past 8 decades, that shift would have changed the balance in Washington. A Filipino-American state, with millions of constituents and steady population growth, would hold guaranteed seats in Congress. It's reasonable to imagine senators and representatives from Manila debating trade with Asia or immigration policy alongside colleagues from California or Illinois. Instead of being an occasional concern, the Pacific would have been a permanent focal point of American politics. Filipino lawmakers would likely shape key conversations on foreign policy and economics, giving the US a more Pacific-centered outlook than it has today. The cultural impact might be what you notice first. Picture ordinary American street food stalls where tacos, hot dogs, and burgers are joined by lumpia and adobo. Because in this alternate timeline, Manila flavors become part of mainstream culture, not just immigrant neighborhoods. Holidays could intertwine too. Undas, the Filipino commemoration of the dead, overlapping with Halloween and the Day of the Dead into something uniquely American. And when you turned on the TV or watched sports, Filipino-American faces wouldn't be rare breakouts. They'd be central, shaping stories and national identity in ways today's history never allowed them to. But integrating the Philippines wouldn't just change the flavor of daily life, it would change how America situates itself in the world. With a state rooted in Asia, the United States would grow up thinking less like an Atlantic power and more like a Pacific anchor. By the 21st century, US-Philippine integration would have reshaped trade and security ties across Asia, likely changing, but not eliminating, Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. Beijing's rise as a regional power may still have happened, but the American foothold so close to its borders would have altered the timing and the dynamics. Instead of surging into the region with economic diplomacy, China might have confronted an entrenched US role decades earlier. That doesn't mean a rivalry disappears, it means the script for that rivalry shifts. And what of Japan? In reality, the US-Japan alliance became the cornerstone of post-war Pacific stability. With the Philippines as a state, that partnership could have looked different. On one hand, the presence of a permanent American state nearby might have reinforced cooperation, a shared front against regional instability. On the other, it could have stirred friction, with overlapping basing rights and competing influence. Either way, statehood for the Philippines ensures the US-Japan story wouldn't simply mirror what we know. It would have been recalibrated by geography and politics from the start. Zooming out, Southeast Asia as a whole would feel the ripple. The Philippines inside the United States would have stood as both a model and a magnet. For nearby nations, that might have tightened coalitions against communism during the Cold War, or it might have drawn insurgent energies toward the Philippines as the most tangible symbol of American influence. In today's world, where Chinese investments and alliances edge deeper into the region, such an alternate past might mean either stronger resistance to that expansion, or earlier flashpoints that guaranteed confrontation. The outcome isn't clear. What's clear is that the region's balance of power would have evolved along different lines. On the home front, the cultural tapestry of America itself would also feel different by now. Filipino traditions, family gatherings, music, language, even the rhythm of community-based living could have reshaped the American social landscape. Stateside debates over multiculturalism in the late 20th century might have played out earlier, and differently, because one of America's largest states would already embody a deeply Asian identity. Instead of the Pacific coast being the edge of America, the country itself would feel like it stretched across the ocean, with Manila no less central to the story than Chicago or Dallas. Layer all of this together and you see a United States that still projects power, but is something closer to the pivot of an interconnected world. Its politics would look more Pacific-focused. Its culture would carry Filipino influences as everyday American experiences. Its foreign relations would have tilted decades earlier toward complicated, competitive dynamics with China, and layered alliances with Japan and the rest of Asia. So the final question hangs in the air. Would that extra reach have made the country safer, or simply put a bigger target on its back? Would embedding a state in Asia secure America's place as a global force, or accelerate the conflicts it was trying to avoid? So, would all that extra influence make the world safer, or simply make America a bigger target? We'll wrap up next. The Philippines as a US state could have marked a turning point, and America redefined and projected deep into Asia. On one side of the ledger, statehood likely would have accelerated US power projection across the Pacific and reshaped the Cold War's opening moves. On the other, the price in political strife, fiscal strain, and social friction, both at home and abroad, might have equaled the benefits, leaving scars as lasting as the advantages. Which country's history would you like us to flip next? Tell me below, and don't forget to subscribe for more alternate timelines. One choice, many ripples. History, as always, is stubbornly complicated.